Hello everybody, and welcome back to Introductory Programming with Python. So in the last video we learned how to get the software environment set up, and as of right now we have Visual Studio Code all ready to go. What we're going to be learning today is about types, variables, and values. So let's actually get started with it. So for this purpose, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start in the command line environment for now, just because I want to execute Python in interactive mode at the beginning. And then we'll switch over and we'll create a file. I'm just going to type in Python by itself on the command prompt, and that's going to enter into the Python environment. So let's start talking about types. So if I were to put a string, so for example, last time we had a program where we printed out hello from Python, and I put single quotes around it like this. So hello from Python, single quote at the beginning, single quote at the end. That's going to create a value. Now in Python, if you just type in a value and hit enter, it just kind of echoes the value back. But notice that I use single quotes around this string. I can also create a string by putting it into double quotes. So for example, I could do something like oops, I forgot to do double quotes. I'm in a habit of using single quotes, and it is a good idea probably to be consistent. That way you don't accidentally use one at the beginning and a different one at the end. But that works as well. So there's all kinds of options for quoting strings. I'm going to give you some more options as we go. But for right now, anyway, you can see how this goes. Now, one of the things that you can do, these are values, and they are values of a string type. And a string is basically a bunch of characters. So the individual characters of the string, like this capital E here, they are just stored in like an array of characters, basically internally to Python. And a string type is a way for you to have a really basic type for things like prompting the user or reading in names and addresses and things like that. Okay, so let's test this out. One of the things that we can always do is we can convert something into a string if we want to. And there is a built-in function in Python for doing that. So for example, if I take the value 22, the value 22 is an integer. It is not a string. But if I want it to be a string, in other words, I want it to be a string consisting of two characters, two-digit characters, then what I can do is I can use str and brackets around it 22. Much like the print function that we learned about in the last video, this is a function that takes a number and it converts it into a string. Actually, string str can take any number of types as its argument. It converts any kind of type to a string. But in this case, it's taking an integer, and it's going to give us a string representation of that integer. So when I hit enter here, you can see that we get 22 with quotes around it. And you can see that the interpreter's favorite kind of quote is also a single quote. So we're similar there. It's kind of the default in Python. But if you're used to other programming languages that use double quotes, it can be sometimes hard to shake that, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so there's the str function. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to show you is a variable. So for example, I have a kitty, and the kitty's name is Lenny. I'm going to create a variable called kitty_name. Now, one important rule about variable names is that it can't have spaces in it. So I'm using an underscore instead of a space. That's kind of a standard thing to do in Python. In a lot of other programming languages, you might use something called camel case, which means you might write the name something more like this. But in Python, you usually use this. It's called snake case, where you use all lowercase, and then in between the words, use an underscore to make it more readable. All right, so Lenny's name is Lenny, and so I'm just going to say kitty name equals Lenny. So this is called an assignment statement, and I'm basically giving that variable, kitty_name, a new value called Lenny. And at this point, once I hit enter, Python's going to know that kitty name is now a variable of string type. Okay, so nothing seems to happen when I do this, but there actually is a variable called kitty name now. So if I just type in kitty name by itself, it'll echo back the name that I put into kitty name. So this is called a variable because, of course, that value could change. I could change my cat's name to something else if I wanted to. But anyway, the variable can change over time. So for things like, account balance, it makes sense that that value should change over time. Okay, so that's an assignment statement. So since we just talked about integers, let's now talk about numeric types. So in Python, unlike a lot of other programming languages, in Python it tries to keep all of the different numeric types nice and uniform. That means it's not really necessary for me to, as a programmer, to know what kind of internal representation this number is using. But there are different types of numbers in most programming languages, including Python. So there are things like integers, like 22, and there are also floating point values, like 3.14, or also called a float for short. And there are also complex numbers and so on in Python. But let's deal with just these two in particular. So much like with the integer, I can also convert 3.14 into a string using the str function. So I can do something like this. I can say convert 3.14 into a string, and when I hit enter, we'll see that it creates a string with the characters inside it. This can be helpful if you have something of one type and you want to coerce it into another type. We can actually do the opposite as well. So for example, imagine I accidentally put in kitty age, and I put in kitty age. I want to set kitty age to be 2, but I accidentally put it in quotes. So this means that the variable kitty age is actually a string variable. So if I type in kitty age, it echoes back to me 2 in quotes, saying it's a string variable. But if I didn't want it to be a string, I wanted it to be an integer, then what I can do is I can use the int function. So if I put in kitty age as an argument to the int function, then it will convert that string to an integer. And in fact, if I want to, I can repair the mistake that I've made, this kitty age being set to a string value. I really wanted kitty age to be set to an integer value. So what I can do is I could do something like this. Kitty age is equal to convert to an integer the kitty age value. This is a little bit complicated because I'm doing an assignment statement here, but I'm actually using kitty age on both sides of the assignment statement. But I don't want you to think of this in terms of a math equals sign. This equals sign here is an assignment statement, and an assignment statement says copy whatever is on the right-hand side into the variable on the left-hand side. Okay, so if you think about that, then it doesn't matter that I'm using kitty age on the right side and the left side, because I'm saying take the value of kitty age and pass it as an argument to the int function, and that converts it to an integer. And then take the resulting integer and copy that value into the kitty age variable. So when I do this now, you'll see that the kitty age variable is no longer a string. So when I type in kitty age, unlike when I did it up here, when it returned a string, it returns an integer now. And that's a little quirk about Python that not every programming language allows you to do. In Python, you can change the type of a variable. It was a string before, and now it's an integer. So it's possible to do that kind of thing. And obviously, you should take good care. Generally speaking, it's not a good idea to have a variable take on different types throughout its lifetime. A variable should actually represent one thing as your program executes. If it represents multiple things, that's just adding to the confusion that you're going to have when you're trying to understand how your program works. Okay. There's also floating point values. So for example, if I wanted to convert a string into a floating point value, assuming that that floating point value contains the characters that could be interpreted as a floating point. So let's say, for example, let's take a variable pi. I could set the variable pi equal to something like this. Okay, but that's a string. So you can see that echoed back when I type in pi. It's got single quotes around it. By the way, another thing that you can do is you can use type. So if you use type of pi, it'll actually give you a response that says, oh, this is, by the way, of type string right now. And if I were to say type, what's the type of kitty age, then it would say that that's an int, because we specifically made it an int as of here. Now keep in mind, if I would have said that, if I would have typed in type kitty age right here, then it would have said that it was a string as well. So you can actually convert this string if you want to. So we can fix pi by doing something like this. I can say float of the old pi version. So float is floating point representation, which allows you to have decimal points. It's going to try to interpret this as a number, and it's going to convert that into its numeric form. But now it's no longer an integer, because integers can't have a fractional part. Now we do have a fractional part, so it stores it as a float. So let's do type of pi. You can see that is now a float. So those are the three main types. And by the way, they also work in between the numeric types. So for example, if I have the number 2, I can convert the number 2 into a float. And so in this case, if I say float 2, that's going to convert 2, which is probably going to be interpreted as an integer. It's going to interpret it as a float. So there are separate types for integers and floats in Python. But because you don't specifically say, I want this variable to be a string, or I want this variable to be an integer, or I want this variable to be a float, Python infers the type of the variable and handles that kind of behind the scenes for you. It does mean that you can have variables that change type over the lifetime of your program, which is not recommended. But it also does mean that as a programmer, you don't have to worry about matching up all of your types exactly right. Okay, so you can convert back and forth. If you take something like pi and you convert it to an integer, just keep in mind we're going to lose some data because pi has the value 3.1415926. Let's just type in pi by itself. You can see that's the value of pi. But if I say, what's the integer of pi, convert pi to an integer, this is called type conversion, you can see we lose all of the decimal part of the number, because we only wanted an integer, and integers can't have any fractional part. All right, so that's the basic idea, and this is fine at the command prompt. I'm just going to quit out of here now. Let's write a really simple program now that uses what we've just learned. So let's create a brand new program, and I'm just going to, let's just save it, and I'm going to call this types.py. Let's say types and variables.py. I'm going to use the snake case for my names as well. All right, so I think what I'm going to do is I'll show you a little bit of basic Python interaction while we're at it. So I'll show you how to output data to the user, which we did use in the previous program, the print function, and how we also can input information from the user. So first of all, let's ask the user for their pet's name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something like pet_name equals input. And input is a function that takes a string, and it's going to print this string out, and then it's going to sit there and wait until the user types in a value and hits enter. So we can put in for our string here, that'll be our prompt. So we can say something like, what is your cat's name? Now here's a problem. Oops. Aside from my bad typing. We're trying to use an apostrophe in here, but apostrophe and a single quote are the exact same character. So there are actually two ways of resolving this in a string. One is we can use a backslash before the apostrophe. I personally am not really liking that too much. So the other way that you can do it is just use the other kind of quote. You can use a double quote around the string, and that way it's not confusing which one is starting and stopping the string and which one is just literally the character inside the string. All right, so let's do something really simple here. All I'm going to do is ask the user for their pet name, and then I'm just going to echo back their pet name by using the print function. The print function prints the value of something. In this case, I'm passing it a variable, so it's going to say, oh, I want to print that variable. So when I run this program now, it's going to sit there and say, what's your cat's name? I should probably put a better string than that because it just puts the cursor right at the end. And I'm going to put Lenny. And then it just echoes back Lenny. for me. So let's fix our prompt here a little bit. Put a colon and maybe a space. It seems a little less goofy that way. Okay, so that's one thing. That's just going to print out the pet's name. That sounds good. Let's now ask for the pet's age. So I'm going to just say input. What is your it says cat, I should say pet, sorry. What is your pet's age? Same thing. And let's have it print back the pet age. So now it's going to ask us for the name, and then it's going to ask us for the age, and then it's going to print out the age just to make sure it was read in correctly. So first of all, what's your pet's name? Lenny. What's your pet's age? 2. And then it prints it out to the console. Now you notice here, there aren't any quotes around this, but I will tell you that this is definitely a string because input, the function input, always returns a string. It doesn't know what we're typing here is meant to be interpreted as an integer or a string, so it always interprets it as a string. And we can actually verify that by printing out the type of pet age. So let's actually do that. We'll print out the type of pet age after we're done. So let's try again. We'll go Lenny, 2, and you can see that it shows that it's a string. I don't want it to be a string. I want it to be an int. And so I want to take this value here and I want to convert it to an int by wrapping the whole thing here, because this function here, when I call input, it's going to return an integer. So this whole thing represents the value that the user typed. So this is going to be the string that the user typed. I'm passing the string that the user typed to the int function, and now pet age should be an integer. Okay, so I'm going to type in the same values again. There we go. You can see that Lenny's age is now 2. All right, so we've got a couple different values here. So now what I could do is I just want to print a summary at the very end. So I'm going to show you something new for this. One of the things that you can do is you can actually take a bunch of values and squash them together into a single string. So for example, you could say something like pet name, and then you could say plus. Now plus will actually join those two strings together. So if I were to say something like pet name, and then put something like apostrophe S, age is, something like that. Let's just do that for now. We're obviously not done. Dot, dot, dot in there. And let's just run this program real quick. I'll type in the information. So you can say, you can see that it says Lenny's age is. And so it actually joined these two strings together. This one here, which I use double quotes for because of the apostrophe, and this one, which is a variable that contains a string. I can use the plus operator to join them together. So if I want to now, I can take the age and join it there. So I can use something like pet age. But now I have a problem. And let's run it to see what the problem is. Put in the name and the age again. And here it says an error message. And this is important. In the near future, I'm going to create a video where I specifically address how to deal with errors and the different types of errors that can happen. But right now, anyway, this is the error information that prints out. And this is the key to me solving the problem. So you can see there are some clues in here. It says specifically, the error is on line 4. So I can look on line 4. I know the problem is right here. And then it shows me the whole line of code that's on line 4 saying this is where the problem is. And then it says can only concatenate string to string, not int. So I'm trying to concatenate an int to a string, and that's not allowed in Python. Concatenate, by the way, is just what we're doing here. We're joining these two strings together using the plus operator. So it's not allowed for me to take an integer and concatenate it. So we actually have learned the secret on how to solve this. We can convert this age to a string if we want to. And so we can just use the str function to convert it to a string. And now this error should go away. So when I run this program and I type in the name and the age again, it says Lenny's age is 2. So it created a string by joining 3 separate strings together. So the pet name, apostrophe S, age is, space, and then the string equivalent of the age. But I don't know about you, but this is super inconvenient. Here I have to use the plus operator to join different strings together. I have to use the str function to turn things that aren't strings into strings. and that's super inconvenient. So that's kind of the old way of doing things in older Python versions. So I'm going to show you the way that you typically do this in new Python. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a string with an F prefix in the front of it. And F is short for formatted. This is a formatted string. And that just simply means that I'm going to have placeholders in the string where I want variable values to be inserted. And placeholders look like this. They look like curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, I put the name of a variable. Actually, there's more than just that, which I can put inside these curly brackets. I could put an entire expression. So I could even, compute some math. I could say 2 plus 2, or I could call a function. But in this case, I just want to put the value of pet name. Oops, I'm supposed to use double quotes here because I forgot about my apostrophe. And I'm just going to say pet name's age is, and let's put another variable in there. I'm going to say pet age. And this is, again, another placeholder. But you can see this is a lot easier to understand. This string is saying, okay, pet name's age is pet age. And so it kind of makes sense. And you can see from the syntax highlighting here, these are shown in blue, that these are placeholders for the value. So it's going to take whatever is in pet name and put it into this space, and whatever is in pet age and put it into this space. And it knows how to convert integers to strings and so on, so everything will work out. So this to me is a lot easier to understand. And this is kind of the norm in most programming languages. Python only introduced this feature relatively recently. Anyway, so this will work the same way. So I can put in Lenny and 2, and it prints out the same message. I put a dot at the end, but otherwise it prints out the same message as the other one did. To print out a dot up here, unfortunately, I'd need another concatenation add a string just containing a dot at the very end, which makes it even more convenient. So certainly this is more convenient. Another cool thing about this formatted string output here is that it allows me to make some changes to how the variables are converted to strings. So for things like, let's say something like pet cost. Let's say there's an adoption fee or something like that, and let's ask the user for that. Something that would work out as a floating point value. How much was the adoption fee? Okay, so now I'm going to have pet cost is going to be a floating point variable. I can put $signs in there, let's say, and then curly brackets to allow me to insert a value. So I can put in pet cost, so kind of unchanged here. And now if I run that, I'm going to have to type in 3 things. So let's say, for example, Lenny, and then age is 2, and the adoption fee was $280. And there you go. Now, unfortunately, in this case, this price here is not formatted in the way that we're typically used to. And so we can change that if we want to. So we can do something like this. So this is going to change how we convert it to a string. And so the colon just separates the variable from the conversion rules. And F is just short for floating point in this case. I know there's an F at the beginning, which means formatted. But this F just means that it's a floating point value. And these two values separated by the dot here are indicating, do we want there to be a 0 represented on the left of the decimal if there is actually no integer part to the number. And then the 2 here is saying how many decimal places should I represent the part on the right-hand side of the value. So let's save and run this program. We'll see that there's very little difference, but it does fix a glaring error. So now if we type in the same 3 values, it puts 2 decimal places, which is pretty handy anyway. So this is a pretty powerful thing. As you're going to see, print statements are only useful for the programmer, really, because these are going to print out to the console, and you're not going to expect the user of your program to use the console if you're writing a game or you're writing an application or you're writing a website. All of these things are not going to use the console. The user's not going to want to use the console. Programmers use the command line. Typically, users do not. But you might want to print out the value of a variable in order to help you debug your program. So that's one of the key debugging tools that we're going to learn about in the future. We just learned about how to do print statements, but I'll show you in what context and how to use them to solve different kinds of errors in a future video. All right, so that's all for today. I just wanted to let you know, now that we're starting to develop code, we're going to have all of this example code is going to be posted to a GitHub page, which I'm going to link to down in the description of this video. So thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time.